Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today Im Yirtzeh Hashem Daf Mem Beis Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin and we pick up today on the bottom line of Mem Beis Amid Aleph in Siman Lamed Beis Sevav. We have been discussing the rather technical details of the making and the preparing of Tefillin, and we continue on that topic today with Sevav. Many of us are familiar when it comes to the writing of Stam, when it comes to the writing of Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzahs. Very often we have what's called sirtut. We have lines that are engraved in the cloth, and the writing is done between the lines of the sirtut. And here in Sevav, the Shulchan Aruch discusses whether or not Tefillin are required to have sirtut. And the Mechaber tells us ein, and the Ramah in a Hagah inserts the word tzarich. So it comes out ein tzarich lisartate. We are not required to make sirtut on Tefillin ki im shita elyoina, with the exception of the very top line of the writing. The top line of the writing of the parsha of Tefillin has to have sirtut. None of the rest of the parshas are required to have sirtut. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, by mezuzah, there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that the mezuzah requires sirtut. So by mezuzah, every line requires sirtut. By tefillin, there is no such halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So why do we require sirtut at all? The reason we require sirtut is because of a very interesting Gemara that appears in Masechtas Gittin on Daf Vav Amid Beis. I think I have a Gittin Gemara over here. Let's see. Yeah, we do. Continue my rather unfortunate habit of being less than perfectly prepared. One day I'll remember to have these things prepared in hand when I start saying the shirs, so I could just open them up and read them. But be that as it may, everybody has their imperfections, I guess. So we have a very interesting Gemara here in Gittin Daf Vav Amid Beis. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, Man lemalon, who could tell us the Rebbe Vyasar bar Samchahu? Who could tell us that Rebbe Vyasar is somebody who could be relied upon? He's a bar Samcha. Says Rashi, what does it mean to be a bar Samcha? Roy lismay chalav. Who says that we could rely on Rebbe Vyasar for Dvar Halacha? Va'oid, and the Gemara suggests that there's more to this question than meets the eye. There's another girsa that appears in the Masaras Hashas over here that takes out the word Va'oid and inserts the word Deha. Why are we asking who could tell us that Rebbe Vyasar is a Bar Samcha? Deha, Ihu, it was him, it was Rebbe Vyasar, Shalach Leila Rabbi Yehuda, who sent the following statement to Rabbi Yehuda. Bnei Adam, the people, ha'oilin misham, who come up to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel, hein kimu ba'atzman, they are fulfilling in themselves the pasuk that says, this is a pasuk in Yoel, vayitenu es hayeled b'zoina, that they exchanged a child for a zayna, v'hayalda machra b'yayin, and they sold a yalda, a young girl, for wine, v'yishtu, and they drank. Very not pleasant pasuk. And when Rebbe Vyasar wrote this, the kasav lay below sirtut. He wrote it without sirtut. So we find that Rebbe Vyasar wrote this letter to Rebbe Yehuda. And in the letter, he quoted this pasuk from Yoel. And when he wrote the pasuk from Yoel, he wrote it without sirtut. V'amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shtayim kaisvin, 2 words from a pasuk we could write. Shalosh ein kaisvin, 3 we cannot write. Rashi says over here, what does this mean? So first of all, the musar that Rabbi Vyasar was giving to those people who left Bavel and came up to Eretz Yisrael, where he says, he quotes this not very complimentary pasuk about these people. You would think coming up to Eretz Yisrael is a wonderful thing. But Rashi says Rabbi Yosef's problem was Shehayu Mishtoyin be'Eretz Yisrael. They would come to Eretz Yisrael and they would stay in Eretz Yisrael. Umanichin noshoisein agunois. And they would leave their wives agunois back in Bavel. They would go for extended stays in Eretz Yisrael and leave their wives at home in Bavel. Ubetelemi periavarivia. And it was also, they were bottled from periavarivia. They were in Eretz Yisrael, their wives were in Bavel. So they were mavatal periavarivia. And Rashi says, Shenei kol be'eineihem yoladim v'yolados. Obviously, it was very kal to them. The idea of having children, of having boys and girls, was very kal to them. They thought that they could stay in Eretz Yisrael and not be Isaac in periavarivia. And that's why he quoted about these people, the pasuk, v'yitenu es hayeled b'zayna, that they traded away a young boy, a yeled, for a zayna, for the services of a zayna, and a yalda they sold for yayin. But the problem was that he wrote this pasuk without sirtut, and the Gemara quotes from Reb Yitzchak that he said shtayim kaisvin. Rashi says shtayim, shtei tevois kaisvin min hamikra. We could write two psukim from a pasuk below sirtut without sirtut, but 3 words from a pasuk require sirtut. So from this Gemara in Gittin, there's a Rambam, and it appears in Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah as well, comes a halacha that when you write psukim, there are times that when you write psukim, you are required to have sirtut. Now, exactly what kind of writing requires sirtut and what kind of writing does not require sirtut is beyond the scope of today's shir. An igeres shalom, stam, a letter, maybe does not require sirtut. Sirtut is only required if you write in ksav ashuris, the type of print that we write with in a Sefer Torah, not if you're writing script. So we could discuss perhaps another time precisely what requires sirtut and what does not. But l'chol hapachas, what we see is that there is another requirement of sirtut, besides the requirement that exists by, let's say, a mezuzah, where there's a halakha l'moshe misinai that you require sirtut. By Tefillin, there is no such halakha l'moshe misinai. But yet, there still is some requirement of sirtut, because the bottom line is that you're writing psukim. And you're writing psukim in ksav ashuris, and you're not writing it on stam, a letter, or you're not writing it just for notes. You're writing a davar shebekdusha. And therefore, we have a requirement over here by Tefillin that while the entire Tefillin do not require sirtut, but the Shita Elyona, the first line, does require sirtut. Now, against that backdrop, let's see the words of the Mishnah Berurah here. Ois kat lechaf, 3 lines from the bottom, Membez Amid Aleph, says the Chavetz Chaim, Shita Elyona, Mishum de Tefillin eina halacha l'Moshe misinai l'sartet. There is no halacha l'Moshe misinai by Tefillin that requires sirtut, k'may mezuzah, like there is by mezuzah. Rak mishum de aser lichtov shalosh tevos mi pasuk b'li sirtut. The only requirement is that you're writing psukim, and you're certainly writing more than just 3 words from a pasuk. And once you write 3 words from a pasuk, at least under certain circumstances, you're required to have sirtut. Al kain, but since the requirement is only the Gemara in Gittin and not a halacha l'Moshe misinai, al kain, therefore, kishemisartet shita elyona, if you make sirtut by the first line, die. That is sufficient. Now, why does sirtut on one line fulfill the requirement of the Gemara in Gittin? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, ki stam b'nei adam yoidim la'amin yadam lichtov kol hashitos yesharos, because most people will be able to train their hand to write straight. Achar shekasru shita elyona. If you made sirtut, and by using the guide of the sirtut on the first line, you wrote the first line straight. Once you wrote the first line straight, you will be able to write the following lines straight as well. But if you didn't make sirtut even on the first line, then you might write everything crooked. And by psukim, there's a requirement that the writing has to be straight and beautiful. Now, the ka'amar ain't tzarich. Now, if you notice the combination of the text of the Mechaber and the Ramah, the words are ain't tzarich l'sartet. You're not required to make sirtut. It explains the Chavetz Chaim that those words were chosen very precisely. Mishum de'im yirtza l'sartet kol hashitin. Because if you want to make sirtut on every line, kedei lichtov yoser b'yosher, so that you'll be able to write in a more straight manner, liyapois hashitos, to make the lines even more beautiful, harishus biyadai, you're allowed to. Now, you might think that there's no chiddush over there, but there is a chiddush. And a matter of fact, it's a chiddush that the Mefarshim, like the Pri Megadim, go into and they discuss, because we have a Yerushalmi that says that if a person is potter, if a person is exempt from something and he does it anyway, nikra hedyot, he's called a hedyot, he's called a fool. If there's no such requirement, why are you doing it? So if somebody goes ahead and he makes sirtut when he's not required to make sirtut, maybe nikra hedyot, maybe he's called a fool. Kamash Balon over here that's not the case. Why? Because it seems that this Yerushalmi that says that if you're potter and you do something, you're called a hedyot, that is if you're doing it l'shem chumrah. In other words, you're potter, and you decided, I don't want to be potter, I want to do it anyway. Then sometimes you could be called a fool. But over here, you're not doing it l'shem chumrah, you're doing it because the point of sirtut is to be able to write beautifully and to write straight. If you feel that you're not going to be able to write straight, by virtue of only having the top line having sirtut, so you want to make sirtut on everything else, then you're doing it for a reason. You're doing it kedei liapos, you're doing it for zekei livan veyu. In that case, it's mutter. Continues the Mishnah Berurah here. Ve'em lo sirteit afilu shita elyoina. If you did not make sirtut, even on the first line, ayin bebiur halacha, then he says you should take a look at the biur halacha. It's interesting because I forgot what he says. So, let me look quickly. It seems that he comes out over here that we don't have a clear raya to say that it's puzzle if it has no sirtut even on the first line. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. If we turn back to Mem Beis Amud Aleph on the bottom line. If you don't know how to write straight without sirtut, yisartet kol hashuros. Then the Mechaber says very, very clearly, then you should make sirtut on every line. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kal Chaf Aleph, yisartet pirush lechatchila mishum zekei livan veyu. Right? If you can't write straight without sirtut on every line, then do sirtut on every line. Avo b'di'eved, but b'di'eved, afilu im loy sirtet. Even if you didn't make sirtut, the cost of ashita is akumois, and you ended up writing crooked, ein lifsai la tefillin, the tefillin are not puzzle. Now we go weiter. Let's see the words of the Mechaber, top line here on Mem Beis Amud Beis. V'lo yisartet ba'oferes. When you make the sirtut, you should not use a pencil. The ferris is a lead pencil. So how do you make sirtut? You engrave, you press a line into the cloth. Now you could do that with a sharp pencil. Says the Mechaber, no. V'lo yisartet ba'oferes, do not make sirtut with a pencil. Why? Mipnei shehamokim hasirtut nishar tzavua. Because a pencil makes a black line. So the line of the sirtut, instead of just being a depressed line, it will end up having color. It will be colorized from the pencil. The Mechaber says you should not do that. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Chaf Beis, but Iferes, you should not use a lead pencil. V'chein b'dyoy, you also should not fill the sirtut with ink. Ubisikra, or maybe with red ink. V'chol kiyotze bazeh, or anything else that makes a mark. Va'afilu bein hashitin also l'sartei poi, and even between the lines. In other words, even if you're not going to make the sirtut right where the letters are going to potentially touch, but instead you're going to make the sirtut between the lines where it's not close to the words of the parsha themselves, still you should not make any kind of sirtut. And if you look at the Sharitzia in Ois Cotton Yutes and Chaf, he brings this down from the Pri Megadim. And looking at the Pri Megadim, it seems that the reason we don't make sirtut with anything that's colorized, the Pri Megadim brings down two reasons. One is from the Ateres Tzvi, and one is from the Lavush. It seems from the Ateres Tzvi that the reason we don't do it is because we don't want any coloration anywhere where the letters might go, because what happens if you make the sirtut and it has some colorization, it has some dye, it has some ink in the sirtut, and then when you write, part of the writing of the oisiyos goes over the writing that's in the sirtut. Now you have ksav al gabe ksav. You have a writing on top of another writing. And we already learned yesterday that we have a suffix whether a ksav al gabe ksav is considered a ksav. So it could be that part of the oisius we don't recognize as being a ksav. So we don't want any extra writing anywhere near where the letters would go. The Lavush says that we don't want any extra writing to appear anywhere on the parshas of the Tefillin, even if it's not near the ksiva itself. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Igros Moshe, the tshuva of the Rishiva Zatzal, the Rishiva Zatzal discusses whether or not you're allowed to make, let's say, a maker's mark on the parsha. The Sefer wants to sign the parsha. Good advertising. Somebody will see beautiful parsha, so know which Sefer to go to. Or maybe you want to have a hechsher, right? We don't know who wrote it, so maybe the Rav HaMakshir, or the one who gave the Sefer Kabbalah, maybe he'll sign it, right? Or maybe you want to make some kind of a identification mark on the parsha to protect it from theft or something of that nature. The Rishiva Zatzal says you're not allowed to write on the parsha any writing other than the words of the Tefillin, not on the side that is the writing and not even on the other side. We don't want to have any extra writing on the parsha. We're going to see that another potential problem with having ink or any kind of colorization, especially diyoi, especially black ink, on the lines of the sirtut, is that if it's near the letters, let's say you write Shema, so you write Shin, Mem, Ayin, and let's say the Shin touches the line, and then the Mem, or the Ayin touches the line. Well, now the Shin and the Ayin are connected by virtue of that line. And we learned yesterday that you can't have letters that are connected one to the other, because then they're not mukefes gvil. They're not surrounded by blank parchment. So you can't have two letters touching each other, and the lines of the sirtut could create a connection between two letters. So for all of these various reasons, the Mechaber told us over here that when you make the sirtut, you should not do it ba'iferes, you should not do it with a lead pencil, or, says the Mishnah Berurah here on Ice Cotton Chav Beis, with anything else that leaves a mark, and the Mishnah Berurah said, not even between the lines. Now we continue in the Mishnah Berurah Ice Cotton Chav Beis, where the Mishnah Berurah says, V'chol zeh lechatchila. This is all lechatchila, aval b'di'eved, ein lahachmir. B'di'eved, we don't have to be machmir. Kain kasav alechem chamudais v'el yerabba. So says the lechem chamudais and the el yerabba, that if we do have sirtut that has some kind of a mark, we don't have to worry about it b'di'eved. However, ubetshuvas dvar Shmuel Siman Shin Samach Beis mefakveik bazeh ma'oid. He takes extreme issue with this position, and he says, "Im misurtat b'shum tzeva shachar." He takes great issue with making the sirtut with any kind of black marking. Why? Because of what I just told you. Machmas negias ois ba'ois al yedei sirtut hashachar. Because, says the Dvar Shmuel, what if two letters become connected by virtue of the black diyoi that's in the sirtut? Now we would have two oisiyos that are mekubaros, which we learned yesterday would passel the Tefillin. Unless we distance the writing under the line of the sirtut enough so that we know the letters will not possibly touch the sirtut, ayin sham. Okay. End of the first line of the Mechaber. Top line says the Rabbah Hagah. V'yesh oimrim, there are those that say shetzarich l'sarte tamid lamayla ulamata umin atztadim. There are those that say that we should make sirtut on top and on bottom and on the sides. Af al pi sheyadeh lichtov b'lo sirtut. Even if the Sefer knows how to write straight and well without sirtut, v'chein noihagin, and he brings down from the Bar Sha'amar and from the Mordechai and the Sefer Truma and the Smag that is the way we are noyig to make sirtut on top of the lines, on bottom of the amud, and on the sides of the amud. Okay, now we go to Sif Zayin, which is a very technical sif. It has no Ramah, it has no Mishnah Berurah, and we really broke this down once previously when we were learning the halachas of the Megillah. And we'll break it down again. It's a little bit technical, but let's go. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai is Tefillin al haklaf. Tefillin is written on the part of the animal's hide that is called klaf. V'loy al haduchsustus, not on the part of the hide which is called duchsustus. V'loy al hagvil, and also not on a hide that is called gvil. So we now have three different types of hide. We have klaf, duchsustus, and gvil, and we will identify shortly all three of them. But the Mechaber tells us that the halacha l'Moshe Sinai is that the tefillin has to be written on the klaf, not on the duchsustus, not on the gvil. Furthermore, says the Mechaber, when we do write on the klaf, kaisvin al haklaf b'mekayim basar. We have to write on the part of the klaf, the surface of the klaf that is closest to the flesh of the animal. And we will describe that shortly in detail as well. V'im shina, and if you change from this requirement, puzzle, then the tefillin are puzzle. And the Bir Halacha in Dibur HaMascha v'im shina puzzle says, kai akulam. These words go back on all of the requirements that the Shulchan Aruch just said. In other words, it has to be written on the klaf, not on the duchsustus, not on the gvil, and it has to be written on the klaf where it's closest to the flesh. And says the Bir Halacha, v'afilu im kasav kutzei shel yud sheloy ala klaf b'mkon basar, even if the only part of the parsha of the tefillin was one kutzei shel yud that wasn't written in the proper place, then it is puzzle. Let's go weiter in the Mechaber here. Mahu klaf u'mahu duchsustus. What is klaf? What is duchsustus? Explains the Mechaber. Ha'or b'shas ibudai. The hide, when we tan the hide. So we strip the hide off the animal, and then we tan it. As part of the tanning process, says the Mechaber, cholkin oisai lishnayim. They generally take the hide and they split it into two splits. And they create an outer split and an inner split. Says the Mechaber, v'chelek hachitzain shehu litzad haseyar, the outer split of the hide. So the section of the hide that is closest to the outer surface of the animal, where the hair of the animal is. Right? So that's the chelek hachitzain, the outer split, shehu litzad haseyar, which is towards the hair side of the animal. Nikra klaf, that is the split that is called klaf. Va'pnimi, the inner split of the hide, hadavuk lebasar, the innermost surface of that inner split is actually attached to the flesh of the animal. Nikra duchsustus, that is called duchsustus. So what we have said so far is we have identified what's the klaf and what's the duchsustus. We take the hide off the animal and it's thick. We then take the thickness of that hide and we split it into two. And we create an outer layer and an inner layer. The outer layer is called klaf. The inner layer is called duchsustus. Now we already know from the beginning of the Mechaber that when we write tefillin, we have to write it on the klaf. So far we know that we have to write the tefillin on the outer layer of the hide, the outer split, the klaf split. But the klaf split also has two surfaces. It has an outer surface, the outer surface of the animal, and it has an inner surface. The inner surface is where the klaf connects to the duchsustus. That's the inner side of the inner surface of the cloth split, which surface do we write on? Do we write on the outer surface or on the inner surface? Says the Mechaber, Ulefizeh, once we have identified that the outer split is called the cloth, and we know that we have to write the tefillin on the cloth, and now we need to determine which surface of the cloth we should write on, the outer surface or the inner surface, we now know the answer. Because what did the Mechaber say in the beginning of Siv Zayin? He said, Halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai is that we write on the cloth, and he said, Kaisvan ala cloth b'mekayim basar. We write on the cloth in the place where it's closest to the basar, to the flesh of the animal. So explains the Mechaber, Ulefi zeh, ki amrinon kaisven ala cloth b'mekayim basar, when the Halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai told us that we should write tefillin on the cloth b'mekayim habasar. What does that mean? The cloth never touches the basar. The cloth is the outer split. The outer split has an outer surface that faces the world. It faces the outside of the animal. It has an inner surface. The inner surface doesn't touch the basar. It touches the dursustis. The dursustis has an inner surface that touches the basar, but the cloth doesn't. So what does it mean, kaisen ala cloth b'mekayim basar? Explains the Mechaber, Hainu b'mokam ha'yoser karov lebasar. It means the surface of the cloth that is closest to the basar. Tahainu, which is b'mekayim chiburai, where it is connected kishehu davak la-dursustis, when it's connected to the dursustis. Oh, so now we have everything figured out. The hide of the animal is split into two. The outer split is the cloth. The inner split is the dursustis. Throw the dursustis away. We can't write tefillin on dursustis. We have to write it on the cloth. The cloth has two surfaces. It has an outer surface and an inner surface. Which surface do we write the tefillin on? Says the Halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai. You know where? Kaisvin ala cloth b'mekayim habasar. You write on the cloth where it's closest to the basar. Where is that? The inner side of the cloth split, where it normally would be attached to the dursustis. That's the surface that's closest to the basar, so that's the surface we have to write on. Continues the Mechaber. Uklafim shalanu, our cloth, says the Mechaber, our cloth, we throw in a wrinkle. Our cloth, klafim shalanu, she'ein cholkim oisam. Oh, we don't split our cloth, our hide, into cloth and dursustis. So now what do? Oh, says the Mechaber, yesh lahem din cloth. Our hide, even though we don't split it, the entire thing is called cloth, v'kaisvam aleim litzad basar. And we write on the inner surface of the hide where it's closest to the basar. Now this is very strange. Hold it. We started this whole discussion. We said we take the hide, we split it in two, and we said that the inner split is the dursustis, and we said you cannot write tefillin on dursustis. Now the Mechaber says, nowadays we don't split the hide. So where should we write? On the inner surface. But isn't that dursustis? So the Mechaber right away answers this kasha, and the Mechaber says like this: why do we write on the inner side? How do we get away with that? Why isn't that called writing on dursustis? Explains the Mechaber, because nowadays the process of making cloth is, we take the entire hide, and even though we don't split it, we go ahead and we tan it, we treat it in salt and in lime, and we soften it, and all the hair falls off, and then we take stones or knives and we scrape the inner surface of the hide, and we scrape a lot off. Says the Mechaber, Shema shemegarerim klipasai ha'elyona shebemakaim haseyar. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a step. We also scrape off the outer surface. Says the Mechaber, this that we scrape off the outer surface, so you might think that by removing the outer surface, that's called removing the cloth. Because remember, we said cloth is the outer split. So maybe if we scrape off the outer surface, maybe everything else is called Dirsustis. Says the Mechaber, no. The little bit that we scrape off out of the outer surface, Shema Shemegarim Klipasayel Yoina Shememakim Seyar, this that we scrape off the outermost surface where the hair is, Einoi Ela Kidei Mashetzarech Lesaknoi Ulahachlikoi. That's only to prepare it so that it can be used as parchment and to remove all of the hair and make it smooth. That is not called taking off the outer split, removing the cloth. When is the outer split called a cloth? If you take the hide and you mamish split it in two, then the outer part is the cloth. But over here, we're not doing that. We're not splitting it. We're scraping off the outer surface, so maybe we scraped off the cloth. No, we didn't scrape off the cloth. We took off a minute amount from the outer surface to make it smooth and to take off the hair. But that's not called taking off the cloth. And the writing that we do on the inner side is not called writing on the Dirsustis. The Farshim say the reason is because we scrape the inner side as well. And when we scrape the inner side, we're taking off the Dirsustis. And then we end up writing on the inner surface of the outer split, the cloth. Even if they would split the hide into two, in other words, he's still answering the kasha. Why isn't the fact that we scrape away the outer surface, why isn't that called removing the cloth? The answer is, he says, because even if we would split the hide into two splits, a cloth split and a Dirsustis split, we still would scrape the outer surface of the cloth split, and that would still be cloth. That's just part of the tanning process. Ubitzad basar, and now when we get to the inside, what we're calling the Dirsustis, goyrim harbe. Over there we scrape away a lot, ad she'ein nishar ela klaf bilvad, until the only thing that's left is the cloth. Okay, now that we read our way through Siv Zayin, I'll just give it to you again a little bit on the outside. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai requires that we write tefillin al klaf, not on Dirsustis. What is klaf? What is Dirsustis? Explains the Mechaber. Back in the day, the way they would prepare parchment is they would take the hide, they would split the hide in two. The outer surface, the outer layer is called klaf, the inner layer is called Dirsustis. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai requires that we write tefillin on the inner side of the klaf, the part that is closest to the flesh of the animal. Nowadays, says the Mechaber, that's not the way we prepare the hides. We do not take the thickness of the hide and split it in two. We keep the hide intact. So now, what should we write the tefillin on? Explains the Mechaber, what we write the tefillin on is, we take this entire hide and we write on the inner surface, the innermost surface of the hide. Why isn't that called writing on Dirsustis? Because even though we don't actually split the hide in two, but we scrape away all of the Dirsustis layer. We take the innermost layer of the hide and we scrape it away. And the Mechaber said, Mitzara basar goyrim harbe. We scrape away a lot. So we're scraping away the entire Dirsustis until the only thing that's left is cloth. And then we're writing on the inner side of the cloth, which is what we're supposed to do. The Mechaber answers another kasha. He says, we know that nowadays they also scrape away the outer surface of the hide. So you might worry, maybe that's called removing the cloth. The same way when we scrape away the inside, we say we're removing the Dirsustis. Maybe when we scrape the outside, we're removing the cloth. Explain the Mechaber, no. Because the difference is when we scrape the outer surface, we scrape it very little. He says we scrape it ela kidei mashetzarech lesaknoi ulahachlikoi. All we do is scrape away a little bit to prepare it and smooth it. That's not called removing the cloth layer. But when we scrape away the inside, we scrape away a lot. So we remove the entire Dirshu this layer, and now what we have left is called klaf, and we write on the inside surface of that klaf. Okay? We're going to stop over here. We'll continue tomorrow with Tzivches. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should send Yeshua Sefuras Parnasa Cheduchim Tol Ozanim, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Goel Tzedek, the Mehera V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.